The sight of a surplus armored vehicle parked behind a local police station tells a story of logistics, contracts, and heavy metal. Writing earlier this week, Whitney Curry Wimbish tracks how war machines are flowing into the hands of American immigration officers and neighborhood cops. It's a ledger of hardware. But a different kind of cost appears when those weapons eventually become the government itself. Matt Gallagher, writing just yesterday, looks back at the 1952 military coup in Egypt to see what happens to the people who once cheered for the soldiers. Something interesting emerges when the tally of rifles and armor is placed alongside the wreckage of broken lives and lost revolutions. $250 billion buys thousands of armored vehicles and rifles. Writing just last week for the American Prospect, Whitney Curry Wimbish maps out the specific contracts behind a sharp surge in deportation spending. Notice how she connects these hardware purchases to the 12,000 new agents hired to carry the gear. It's a group that includes recruits who previously failed police academies or were caught lying on official felony reports.
Federal agents and local cops are inking thousands of deals to collaborate on immigration law enforcement, while stockpiling historic amounts of military-grade weapons. That's the takeaway from contractual agreements, federal procurement records, Department of Defense property data, and information obtained through records requests, the Prospect found. A year after President Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill Act poured a record amount of money into his mass deportation project, which, after a second law passed this year, now comes to nearly $250 billion, the United States is in the grip of a heavily militarized joint force whose goal is to throw 1 million people out of the country annually. It stands to harm immigrants, protesters, and community members in general because the federal government rapidly hired 12,000 officers and agents to staff it without requiring they meet rigorous standards or background checks, immigration advocates, attorneys, and researchers told the Prospect. More from Whitney Curry Wimbish. An Associated Press investigation found, for example, that the new recruits include those who failed to graduate from a police academy, were caught lying in a police report to, quote, justify a felony charge against an innocent woman, used excessive force, and faced lawsuits alleging misconduct in prior law enforcement positions. The number one thing I worry about and think about all the time with the basically doubling or tripling the size of ICE is they attempted to do that at a time when there's a nationwide shortage of law enforcement officers, said Kenneth Lawande, associate professor of political science at Rice University, who researches military equipment and law enforcement and was a creator of an interactive map on the topic.
Police departments can't find qualified applicants to fill jobs, he said, but immigration agents don't have to meet the same standards to get hired, nor must they undertake the same length of training. So basically, you put military-style weapons in the hands of undertrained, likely unqualified applicants, or applicants that wouldn't have otherwise found a law enforcement job, Lawande said. It is now the largest federal police force there is, and by any measure, it's a low-quality police force when you compare it to, say, the LAPD. To me, that's why there was such a conflagration in Minnesota. Trump's policies are contributing to the violence in multiple ways. One is by encouraging local police departments to sign so-called 287G deals to work with ICE, which more have done in his second term than at any point since Congress authorized the deals in 1996 under the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. For years, the number of 287G deals between cops and ICE remained in the double digits after the Florida Department of Law Enforcement signed the first one in 2002. There were just 35 at the end of the Obama administration, but they rose to 150 under the first Trump administration, then skyrocketed to 2,116 as of last Thursday, federal data shows. There are three types of agreements. In the task force model, ICE trains local officers to enforce immigration law during traffic stops and other routine police work, after which cops may issue ICE detainers, requests for local jails to imprison suspected foreign nationals for up to 40 hours more than they would have been otherwise, as well as arrest warrants and search warrants.
President Barack Obama discontinued this option because law enforcement was using it to racially profile black and brown people and violate their civil rights. But Trump reinstated it when he returned to the White House. It is now the most popular of the three arrangements. The jail enforcement model allows local law enforcement to interrogate people arrested on state or local charges about their immigration status and issue immigration detainers. The warrant service officer model deputizes local law enforcement officers to perform arrest functions of immigration officers within jails and to execute administrative warrants, but it doesn't allow them to interrogate alleged non-citizens about their immigration status. Local law enforcement agencies originally signed 287G because they ideologically aligned with mass deportation, said Asya Magazinek, professor of social data science at the Hertie School in Berlin. Magazinek, who researches 287G programs, studied why the federal government extends its power downward in immigration enforcement in particular, and found that the deals benefited both sides. The federal government gets a subsidy of effort from local cops, and local cops get to participate in immigration enforcement, where they previously wanted to but did not have permission. Initially, this meant that only the most anti-immigrant law enforcement departments were signing deals, such as the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office under Sheriff Joe Arpaio, whom the Department of Justice stripped in 2011 of the power to enforce federal immigration laws over civil rights abuses he allegedly inflicted through a 287G agreement. The new factor drawing in police departments that were on the fence, Magazinek said, is money.
Under the task force model, the local department may receive $7,500 for equipment, salary, and benefit reimbursements for every officer trained, $100,000 for new vehicles, and overtime funds up to 25% of salary, details spelled out in a brochure selling the program. Magazinek's research shows that after signing a 287G task force agreement, local police spend more time in areas where immigrants are known to work. They make traffic stops over broken headlights, check identification and immigration status, and detain mostly people with no previous crimes or only low-level misdemeanors, individuals they would not have detained before. Trump is also encouraging violence through programs and funding that puts weapons of war in the hands of police officers and immigration agents, some of which are working together under 287G agreements. Local law enforcement can get war machines a variety of ways, including through the 1033 program, which transfers extra military weapons from the Department of Defense to local police and sheriff's departments, and the 1122 program, under which states and governments can buy equipment for homeland security, anti-drug, and emergency response purposes. Both Obama and Joe Biden tried to curtail weapons transfers, but federal data shows that police departments throughout the country continue to possess grenade launchers, armored tanks, military-grade rifles, drones, and bayonets.
In Ohio, for example, where the 50,000-strong Haitian community in Springfield and elsewhere is bracing for mass deportations after the Supreme Court ended temporary protected status earlier this month, police departments have added about $3 million worth of weapons to their stockpile over the last 2 years, including a $424,403 so-called non-lethal weapons set, multiple aerial drones, remote control and ground vehicles, and various scopes for small arms. That's on top of the materiel they already had, including more than 2,000 military rifles, 46 tanks, and the $850,000 Special Operations Media System and Mobile Radio Broadcasting Subsystem that the Mount Orab Police Department obtained in 2015. That system, sometimes referred to as SOMS-B, is media broadcast equipment that the U.S. military uses for psychological operations in war zones to propagandize the local population and erode their resolve. The police department did not respond to a request for information about how the PSYOP system has been used and whether it's still in use. 22 law enforcement agencies in Ohio have 287G agreements with ICE. Not all of them have weapons through the 1033 program. Those that do include the police departments of Fayetteville, Northampton, Sardinia, and Spencer, and the sheriff's offices of Butler, Geauga, and Portage counties, which together have amassed $1.5 million worth of military weapons. The department in Portage County and Sardinia have the most, mainly dozens of military rifles and pistols. As of last July, there were slightly more than 163,400 people living in Portage County. There are about 1,100 people in Sardinia. At the same time that local police departments are arming up, ICE is spending a record amount of money on its own small arms shopping spree.
According to federal procurement data, the agency spent $80 million on small arms weapons last year, the most in any year since 2008 by a wide margin. The year before, it spent just $18.8 million, and in 2023, $16.4 million. Already in this year,
ICE has spent nearly $26 million on small arms. Some of its biggest recent purchases include nearly $20 million for a pair of contracts to Quantico Tactical and Geisel Automatics for various firearms and precision long guns, $4.7 million to Sig Sauer for red dot sights, a gadget for semi-automatic pistols and shotguns, and $4.3 million to Atlantic Diving Supply for gun silencers. Researchers and advocates said that even if a police department doesn't have an agreement with ICE, its officers may still be at immigration raids and anti-ICE protests. That's because ICE doesn't handle its own crowd control. It calls local police to do that, they said. And even if a local police department has no 287G agreement and is ideologically opposed to ICE, it may share the jurisdiction with a sheriff who has inked such a deal and wants to terrorize immigrants, or one who believes the law does not apply to them, as the Claremont Institute-backed extreme-right constitutional sheriffs do, said researcher and author Jessica Pishko, who wrote a book on the subject. How much military materiel is flowing into communities specifically to hunt immigrants is impossible to know, researchers told The Prospect. The information the federal government publishes is incomplete, as are the datasets published by local authorities, scholars, advocacy organizations, and media outlets. It's likewise impossible to know what machinery armed forces are actually using as part of Trump's mass deportations.
This is the very pernicious thing about the way the immigrant enforcement system and the criminal justice system have become completely intertwined, Magazinik told The Prospect. Immigration is a civil matter in principle, but when you marry immigration enforcement with street-level policing, that line gets blurred.
A $250 billion pile of military hardware and the ink on thousands of local police contracts. That's the image Whitney Curry Wimbish leaves behind. It shows a country arming itself against its own neighbors, where the primary worry is the lack of training behind the trigger of a new rifle. The hardware is the story there. The interesting thing is how the focus shifts when turning to Matt Gallagher. He looks past the procurement records and the literal weight of the tanks to find the wreckage of a life in the wake of a military coup that happened decades ago in Egypt. Read alongside Wimbish, Gallagher's account of an exiled writer's suicide in a London flat starts to look like a warning about the far end of that same path. While Wimbish tracks the physical tools of state force, Gallagher follows the slow rot of disillusionment that sets in once the soldiers take over. These two writers are looking at opposite ends of the same timeline, one at the moment the engine is being started, and the other long after it has finished its work. It suggests the real danger isn't just who holds the gun, but what happens to a person's sense of possibility once the guns become the only way to talk to one another.
Join War on the Rocks and gain access to content trusted by policymakers, military leaders, and strategic thinkers worldwide. Wagih Gali, Beer in the Snooker Club, Vintage International, 2014. The noise, the unrelenting noise of the world. How is any writer with an interest in the long view supposed to escape it, if only for a couple hours to work, let alone maintain their sanity in the remainders of a day? It's an old dilemma, for certain, but little digital town criers in our pockets bring constant news about slaughter and ruin in Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, and beyond. Grim notices against the background of those chronicling the state of domestic American politics. Perhaps one could forgive the hyperbolic conclusion that the literary minds of yesteryear did not have to deal with all this fuckery. So one reads of then and now because we can and must. And then one remembers that writing has always been something of a defiant act against the world's ceaselessness, even when it is scrutinizing the very same. To wit, in late December 1968, an Egyptian writer and political exile named Wagih Gali swallowed 26 sleeping pills at the London home of his friend and occasional lover, editor Diana Athill. Rushed to a nearby hospital, Gali died 10 days later, believing himself an abject failure and leaving behind a miscellany of essays, diaries, and journalism, along with one well-regarded novel published 5 years prior to a suicide, Beer in the Snooker Club. There's plenty of both beer and snooker in Beer in the Snooker Club, but the juvenility carried in the title deceives. It's a political book, and a serious one, centered on the aftermath of Egypt's 1952 revolution and military coup, and succeeds largely because its narrator goes out of his way to be anything but, well, political. Young Ram Bey enjoys women, gambling, booze, and his family's privileged social station, though he is intelligent and sensitive enough to know these things cannot square with the change he believes in notionally. A lesser book would have followed Ram's friend Font, an angry, devout socialist who has never seen a protest he wouldn't join. But Beer in the Snooker Club is a book of ambivalence and disappointment. It is as critical of those forces who seek upheaval without a vision for what comes after, as it is of the old, entrenched Cairo elite. Ram and Font are Copts, members of Egypt's indigenous Christian minority. 6 years prior to the events chronicled in the book, they joined the uprising of the Suez Crisis, filled with brimstone clarity. For his efforts, Font gets shot in the thigh, while Ram cannot shut off his inner voice, asking questions that tend to prove unwelcome in the moment of sweeping ideological movements. A later trip to London, the center of empire, further strains their friendship and diverging beliefs. By the time we meet them in post-colonial and post-revolution Cairo, the two friends still care for one another, even while being baffled by what the other has taken from their shared journey. In the West, the 1956 Suez Crisis often marks the end of British might and global reach. In Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser's political strength solidified with the triumph, his authoritarian regime now able to do much more than nationalize a canal. Replacing a king with a military dictatorship had not been the goal of young idealists such as Ram and Font, but they weren't part of the free officers movement that led the coup. Ram and Font are just a pair of angry kids willing to fight for a better tomorrow, fuzzy on the details, smarter than many, but not influential enough to do much, and caught against historical forces far beyond them. Though Ram goes to great lengths to pretend otherwise, he's maintained a sense of the cause. Deep in the novel, he reveals to the reader, while concealing from Font, his work cataloging prison abuses to help undermine the new military regime. I drive once a week to those places to visit police officers supposed to be friends of mine. They hand me an envelope containing pictures and reports written by the inmates, and in return, I pay them a certain sum of money. I have the terrible feeling that some of the pictures wouldn't be so gory if we didn't pay for them. What beautiful ambiguity. What damning self-awareness. Though he is modest about them, Ram's actions are brave and dangerous. If caught sending those photographs to newspapers, he'll join those detained. Yet there is a knowing irony and sense of complicity to his voice and worldview as he details it. Mentioned almost as an aside, it completely transforms our understanding of our narrator. This is not the firebrand absolutist from 6 years earlier, but someone else. All of a sudden, his superficial detachment becomes a front. All of a sudden, his cynicism reads more like disillusionment. All of a sudden, the spoiled party boy who enjoys the good life becomes a man of hidden ideals he's guarded from the world. His country and beliefs have wounded him, yet he endures because he must. That he cannot bring himself to share what he does with Font, who would be proud, supportive, and envious, makes it all the more wrenching. Then there is Edna Salva, and the love-lost story that shadows the plot of Beer in the Snooker Club. Edna comes from one of the richest Jewish families in Egypt, our Woolworths, and makes for a poor pairing with Ram. Even beyond their religious, cultural, and social divides, he's confounded by her activism, and she by his bystanding. He wonders why she betrays her class. She wonders why he betrays himself. There's also her political union with a deported communist to consider. But Ram and Edna love one another, deeply, ferociously, and they find it difficult to keep away, even as they both know they should. After a night together at the Giza pyramids, Ram muses, 2 bodies and 2 brains and 2 lives clasped together, and nothing else mattered. To be loved by and to possess the person we love is why we were born. Ah, yes, he's a closet romantic, buried under layers of scorn and sarcasm. No one could ever mock Ram for this quite as snidely as he does himself. But love can only ever transcend so much. When Ram discusses Edna with his modish and class-conscious mother, she tells him, she didn't care whom I married, as long as she knew I was happy, if Edna would accept me, that is, because they were multimillionaires. She was also older than me, my mother said. Suddenly, she told me to marry for love and started weeping. These are not tears of joy, but of parental fears and worldly awareness. Over the course of the story, it becomes clear that Edna and her family may soon have to leave Egypt, as Ghali himself already had by the time he wrote Beer in the Snooker Club. The pan-Arabism of the Nasser regime has taken hold of the country. While that means certain things for Copts, the novel opens with Ram observing an aunt pretending to be glad about selling off acres of land at markdown, a gift, she suggests, made out of generosity, and not because the government has instituted new restrictions on land ownership. It means altogether other things for the old Jewish families of Cairo. "Why don't you go away, Edna?" Ram advises, after seeing a fresh scar on her face, a thick line of raw flesh, from a regime officer's whip, her punishment for traveling to an Israeli kibbutz and then returning. "Why don't you go to Israel, or South Africa, or France, or anywhere else and live and be happy?" "Because I am Egyptian," she says. Egypt's ancient and often prosperous Jewish population largely left in the 1950s and 60s due to mounting persecution, overseen and encouraged by the Nasser regime. The year prior to Ghali's death, the Six-Day War broke out in the Middle East. He wrote in his diary that there is something nauseating about someone living here, far away from it all, and permitting himself to judge. So he traveled to Israel as a journalist in the war's aftermath to cover the devastating impact on civilians, including expelled Palestinians. He criticized Egypt's authoritarian regime and the policies of the Israeli government alike, according to Ghali biographer Susie Thomas, which led to him angering most everyone. His home nation would soon claim he'd committed treason. A return to Egypt likely meant death. Ghali was devastated, branded a traitor and cautionary tale. His already shaky mental health declined further. In the diary he left for Athil to read, he described his suicide as the one authentic act of my life. A cry of pain, certainly, and also an echo of young, jaded Ram Bey from his novel, who refused to be anything but himself when pressed about the nature of his political allegiances. "I am insincere," Ram said, and Ghali wrote, "but honest." Through that honesty and ambivalence, and embittered courage, too, emerges Ghali's most authentic creative rendering. The world broke him. So what? It breaks us all eventually. At least anyone who ever tries to do something meaningful. Revolutions, counter-revolutions, uprisings, incremental change, they all leave believers in their wake. Ghali managed to capture something that matters long past his own death, not in spite of confusion and the world's terrible ceaselessness, but because of them. Matt Gallagher is the author of 4 books, including the novels Daybreak and Youngblood, a finalist for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. Image, ChatGPT.
A surplus tank idling in a precinct lot isn't just a piece of heavy machinery. In Egypt, those same steel silhouettes eventually became the backdrop for decades of quiet heartbreak. It starts with a line item, a crate of rifles or an armored truck, but it ends with a shift in how a person views their own street. What lingers is the way this hardware reshapes the people on both sides of the glass. When the tools of war become the tools of everyday policing, what happens to the trust that holds a neighborhood together?